The city of Carthage was a metropolis of its time. With a cosmopolitan population of around 750,000 souls and the riches of a vast empire at its fingertips, this African city would have rivaled Rome in its prime. Sadly, much of this history is lost to us. But in this video, we will bring you back in time to visit this lost treasure, from its gargantuan triple walls, to its massive naval harbor, its Edenic garden district, its bustling acropolis, and more. So today, let us step inside the walls of ancient Carthage. So if you're like me and use YouTube for basically everything from news to education and entertainment, then you're definitely going to want to check out YouTube Premium. It's a better experience and it helps support the channel. And a disclaimer before we get started, if you subscribe through the link in this post or the banner appearing in this video, I may get a commission. There's a bunch of benefits. First, YouTube Premium cuts the ads. Second, YouTube Premium makes the experience much more enjoyable and flexible. Features like background play lets you play videos off screen while you do other things on your phone or lock it entirely. Smart Downloads lets you preload content for when you have no internet or poor data. And Continue Watching lets you transition between devices seamlessly. Third, you'll get access to the YouTube Music app for ad-free, offline, and in the background streaming. There's many more perks included, but one of the key concepts is that part of your monthly fee actually goes in to directly support channels like Invicta. So to give you a taste, we've actually worked with YouTube to offer a 2-month free trial, which you can start today by checking out the description. And please, if you do subscribe, use our link as Invicta gets commission from this program. So anyways, try it out, enjoy, and I'll see you out there. While the city of Carthage would eventually emerge as one of the grandest of its age, it certainly had humble beginnings. According to legend, this began in 814 BC, when Dido and her Phoenician entourage from Tyre established a colony on a promontory jutting out from the African coast. It was an ideal, strategic location at the hub of Mediterranean trade routes with defensible terrain in the form of a series of hills and surrounding shores. The only problem was that Hyarbas, a local African king, controlled the land. According to tradition, when Dido requested the land for a city, Hyarbas laughed at her and told her mockingly that she could found her city on whatever land she could cover with an ox hide. Dido, in a show of Punic craftiness, then cut the ox hide into thin strips, which she used to outline a claim large enough for an entirely new city. This tale is preserved in the central hill of Carthage, the Byrsa Hill, which in Greek translates to ox hide. Regardless of the veracity of the legend, archaeology seems to back up the idea that some of the earliest habitation in the area occurred around the vicinity of the Byrsa Hill. In these early years, a mix of residential and commercial buildings sprung up to occupy the space between the defensible acropolis and the emerging merchant port. Within these grounds would have also been a central agora for meetings and market activities, as well as numerous temples and public buildings. An early wall likely protected key parts of the burgeoning town, with evidence that around the 5th century BC, powerful fortifications were built along the seafront. But with the boons of a growing empire bearing fruit, little could stop the Carthaginian citizens from spilling out beyond its confines. As each new generation arose, they fueled a new wave of development across the lands. Fields, orchards, farmhouses, villas, water canals, roads, warehouses, workshops, stables, and more sprung up as far as the eye could see. Soon, even the ancestors, once laid to rest upon the nearby hills, were being encroached upon by their descendants. By the time of the Punic Wars in the 3rd century BC, Carthage had grown to an enormous size, covering much of the promontory and boasting a peak population estimated at 750,000 people. By now, its demographic makeup consisted of not just Phoenician immigrants, but also local Libyans, Numidians, Greeks, Italians, Iberians, Celts, and all manner of folk from the wider Mediterranean, which were drawn one way or another to the cosmopolitan metropolis. The city itself would have been broken out into a series of districts, though their exact demarcations from this period largely elude us. For now, we can at least present some general areas of interest and spend some time visiting each one in turn. We can begin with the city's outer walls, of which there were two sets, the sea walls and the land walls. The former are considerably longer, stretching out over 25 kilometers. These appear to have been a line of sturdy stone walls, 10 meters tall and 5 meters thick, which were studded with towers for defense and observation. Access was granted to the outside by a series of gates, the most prominent of which were the Great Sea Gates. With dual passages, presumably for entry and exit, these likely saw the heaviest traffic. After all, they stood as one of the easiest ways to reach the shores from within Carthage and were thus a portal through which many merchants and fishermen commuted to work. But it is the land walls of Carthage which were the most impressive. While some defenses had likely existed on this flank for quite some time, they seem to have received a substantial upgrade around the end of the Greco-Punic Wars when Agathocles invaded in 310 BC. According to Appian quoting Polybius, they are said to have been made of 3 layers. Their exact nature is up to some interpretation, but comparing them to the remains of the nearby walled city of Thapsus gives us some better insight. Here you can see one possible diagram of these defenses, consisting of 3 paired sets of walls and ditches, which together span across the 5 kilometers of the isthmus's neck. To maintain fields of fire, the outermost barricade would have been the lowest and might have consisted of a simple stone curtain wall or a wooden palisade. Behind it was a more robust stone wall, at least 5 meters thick and perhaps a dozen meters tall. Behind it was yet another ditch and wall. This last defense stood 15 meters high and 10 meters thick and was punctuated every 60 meters by a 4-story tower. Beneath these walls, the Carthaginians built a number of stables, barracks, and storehouses, reportedly capable of housing 300 elephants, 4,000 horses, and 24,000 soldiers, as well as fodder for all of them. Just inside the walls of Carthage would have been its outer districts. The most prominent of these was the Megara. It was a massive, semi-rural expanse which Appian describes as follows. Quote, "It is planted with gardens and full of fruit-bearing trees divided off by low walls, hedges, and brambles, besides deep ditches full of water running in every direction." It was here that one would have been overwhelmed by the sights and smells of Carthage's extraordinary agricultural wonders. After all, these lands would have been tended to by not just some of the most skilled gardeners and arborists of Carthage, but also its wealthy citizens who were known to write some of the most renowned and extensive treatises on the subject in all of the ancient world. I will now quote from Diodorus Siculus, who seems to have had access to an eyewitness to such Punic landscapes. Quote, "The country was divided into gardens and plantations of every kind. There were also country houses, one after another, constructed in luxurious fashion and covered in stucco, which gave evidence of the wealth of the people who possessed them. The farm buildings were filled with everything that was needed for enjoyment. Part of the land was planted with vines, part yielded olives, and was also planted thickly with other varieties of fruit-bearing trees. On either side, herds of cattle and flocks of sheep pastured on the plain, and the neighboring meadows were filled with grazing herds. In general, there was a manifold prosperity in the region, since the leading Carthaginians had laid out their private estates, and with their wealth had beautified them for their enjoyment." The appeal of the Megara certainly seems evident. It is for this reason that those stuck in the more crowded regions of the inner city gradually made their way to its outskirts. In time, this movement reportedly began to form a new city to the north of Old Carthage, which may have been nestled somewhere in its northeastern hills. For now, let us travel in the opposite direction. We will pass over the old inner walls of the capital and head for its acropolis atop the Byrsa hill. Here, the Carthaginians built a glorious temple to Eshmun, which was said to be the richest of their shrines. Its perimeter bristled with defenses, with primary access being restricted to a 60-flight grand staircase rising from the coastal plains below. Due to its commanding view of the city, it would be here that the Carthaginians would choose to make their final stand against the Roman invaders. On the gentle slopes of the Byrsa were residential districts which featured a slice of the social strata. The homes of the elite were likely higher up the hill in what was known as the Hannibal Quarter. Their elevated position brought with it the natural advantages of an improved view and fresher air. The latter was likely important, given the general practice in antiquity of running sewage through channels cut next to roads. To mitigate this though, it seems that in at least one instance, the structures in this area featured indoor plumbing. As to the designs of these wealthier residences, evidence suggests they were similar to their Roman counterparts with central courtyards and cisterns. The interiors would certainly have been splendidly decorated with mosaics, paintings, statues, and all manner of opulent possessions. Slightly lower down the hill tended to be the houses for the poor. Simpler homes would have been humble dwellings with flat-top roofs which made for a convenient place to cool off and hang laundry in the breeze. Along its exteriors would have been spaces to work, relax, and mingle with one's neighbors in an environment which would have been similar to many other communities across the Mediterranean. Inside would be a more private space which families would have molded to meet their needs and make them feel truly at home. This might include adorning the walls with hereditary decorations and a shrine with a favored deity. Over the years, some families may have even been able to climb up the social ladder, welcoming distinguished guests and tutors who might raise their children with dreams of ever greater achievements. Yet as in Rome, such advancement was a distant dream for the poor who were crammed into dense apartment blocks. There were many of these in Carthage, with the largest of them rising to a height of 6 stories in the Old City district. Archaeology indicates that navigating one's way around the Bursa Hill would have been tricky in most places. So as to follow the terrain, streets tended to be thin and weaving, with only enough room for foot traffic rather than carts. However, there were key routes which made travel easier. These took the form of 3 large avenues which led down to the agora below. For visitors, these would have offered one of the most impressive ways to witness the city. For invaders, though, they would prove to be funnels into killing fields, as the Romans discovered in their bloody fight up these streets flanked by apartments on their way to the Acropolis. But let us now travel in peace to the heart of the city below. Its gravitational center was the great agora of Carthage. It was here that people congregated for economic, social, or religious activity, and in all likelihood where politicians met and trials were conducted. For a literal taste of what might be on offer from the Great Agora, we will pass you on to our friend Max Miller, who can offer insight on a humble but famous Punic dish recorded by the Roman Cato.
Maybe as you make your way through a market of ancient Carthage, you'll see someone, a Carthaginian citizen, sitting down to a bowl of pulse punica, Carthaginian porridge, which is what I'm going to do right now. And here we are, pulse punica, the porridge of Carthage. So I gotta say, it's not the prettiest dish I've ever seen. Kind of looks like oatmeal and cottage cheese were mixed together, neither of which are pretty in and of themselves, but let's see how it tastes. I have to say, I don't know what I was expecting it to taste like, but it wasn't this. I've had pulses before. I made one for the Gladiator episode, and they're a lot more grain heavy. This one has a lot more cheese. It's 3 pounds of cheese for every 1 pound of grain, so of course it's a lot more cheese. And so it's more like a dessert pulse. With the honey in there, it's kind of sweet. It's actually really good. I actually drizzled a little bit more honey on there at the end, and I think that that's a good thing. Depends on if you want it really sweet or not, but it does kind of add a little bit more sweetness, but it's still not overly sweet, which is weird because a lot of ancient Roman recipes that use honey, it's a lot of honey that just ends up becoming the only flavor that you're eating, but this one, you're getting more of the cheese. The only thing I'm not really getting is the grain, and that's fine because it is mostly cheese. So this is definitely an ancient recipe worth trying. It's not a lot of work, a pretty simple dish, and worthwhile. But again, I would make a smaller portion like I did because you're not going to want a huge bowl of this. Unless, of course, you're feeding Hannibal's army, then go with the full amount.
Thanks, Max. Returning now to the Agora. In the vicinity were other important public buildings and temples dedicated to the likes of Reshef, Baal Saphon, and Melkart. Many of these temples were completely lost in the razing of Carthage and subsequent leveling of their Acropolis, and thus only remain in references from literature. One religious site, however, which does survive in some form is the Tophet, which was a place of worship for Baal Hamon and Tanit, and which was the resting place for thousands of Carthaginian children. Scattered about were many other residential and commercial districts which were often intertwined. For instance, lucky Carthaginians might have run small shops connected to houses or apartment buildings from which they might operate a workshop, tavern, or restaurant. The city apparently had a flourishing metalworking industry, as blacksmiths and metalworking sites were abundant. Potters and artisans of all kinds also existed, as can be seen with the discovery of a jeweler's workshop which handled obsidian, coral, and semi-precious stones. But not all shops could be readily found in these centralized locations. The more disruptive trades, such as the tanners and the fullers, had to be located on the outskirts of town. With this understanding in mind, let us now turn to the final and perhaps most critical district of the flourishing imperial city, its primary naval port, known as the Kothon. It was actually composed of two parts, the outer commercial harbor and the inner military harbor, both of which were surrounded by numerous warehouses. The commercial harbor had likely existed in some form prior to this, which was expanded gradually over the years. By the time of Carthage's peak, it was large enough to anchor many dozens of vessels whose cargo would efficiently be loaded and offloaded by an army of dock workers. The goods passing through these facilities would have been truly impressive, both in scope and scale, with products from across the known world. The military harbor was just as impressive. Built rather late in Carthage's history, it was established with a singular purpose: to house the maritime empire's vaunted fleet. The structure was circular in nature, with massive walls that enclosed a ring of ship sheds. In the center was a man-made island with yet more sheds and the admiral's tower. It was from here that he might supervise the activities of the area, and in times of war, order the lowering of chains at the harbor entrance to seal it off from attack. This would be of utmost importance, as it was through the Kothon complex that the Romans would ultimately thrust their dagger in the final siege of Carthage. But such matters will have to wait for another time. For now, we hope you've appreciated our tour of the great city in its prime. All too often, we see Carthage only through the lens of military conflict, with comparisons being drawn between it and Rome's military institutions. But what about the far more important institutions that steered the Punic civilization as a whole? Today, we'll be diving into the history of Carthage's government. The Carthaginians traced their roots back to ancient Phoenicians of the Bronze Age Levant. As was customary for the era and the region, these forebears were ruled by kings in a monarchical system of government. Thus, when Carthage was founded as a colony, it too was ruled in this top-down manner. We don't have many records of what exactly this looked like, but it seems that such colonies were typically appointed governors by their mother city. These rulers would have acted as the supreme authority for each settlement. Assisting them locally were likely advisors plucked from the leading families of the city. Early on, these individuals would have been wealthy and well-connected aristocrats arriving from Tyre. As the colony grew, however, so too did its aristocracy, as many rose to join their ranks. There were likely many more administrative positions in this early government to deal with things like law, trade, and religion, but sadly we have no records to confirm any conjectures. Carthage's early government lasted for about 200 years, until Tyre fell into decline around the 6th century BC. This shift led to the political independence of its western colonies and appears to have prompted Carthage to adopt a new constitution. Its structure was that of an oligarchic republic. We will recap this briefly now before diving into the details. At the highest level, the position of governor was replaced by that of two annually elected leaders called Sophites, while the governor's aristocratic advising body was transformed into a senate. Together, they would be in charge of proposing legislation and conducting diplomacy. Below them was a popular assembly made up of the wider citizen body. It elected magistrates to higher office and could debate, amend, and ratify proposals handed down to it. Filling out the rest of the bureaucracy would be a host of other magisterial offices and bodies that took up residence across the ever-expanding landscape of Carthage. Over the years, the city and its system of government would continue to evolve as reforms were implemented to meet the needs of the people and the interests of its ruling factions. With this general understanding in place, let's now take a look at the government of Carthage. We will begin from the highest levels and work our way down. As we do so, it will be important to note that in Carthage, it was possible for individuals to hold multiple positions simultaneously, a fact which is to be contrasted with the more sequential cursus honorum in Rome. The Sophites were the two chief magistrates at the top of the Carthaginian government. They were elected annually, with evidence pointing to the vote being held through the popular assembly. According to Aristotle, candidates for such high office required sufficient wealth and birth, though we have no details about whether these were actual legal requirements, and if so, what were the minimum thresholds. Surely individuals were at least Carthaginian citizens, but full Punic ancestry does not appear to have been necessary, as can be seen with the election of Hamilcar in 480 BC, whose mother was Greek. Having held previous office, or being able to point to relatives who had, would also have boosted a candidate's chances. Indeed, attaining the position of Sophite was a great honor, which would be a point of family pride for generations. So what did these Sophites do? Well, they worked closely with the Senate to steer the ship of state. It appears that their role included convening Senate meetings, making proposals, and consulting with the body on important matters. Because of this close relationship, let's now turn to the Senate for a better understanding of things. The Senate was the chief legislative body composed of somewhere around 200 to 300 members. Within this group, there was possibly an inner council of 30 leading senators or ex-Sophites. Candidates for these higher offices would also have faced similar requirements of wealth and birth as seen with the Sophites, though to a slightly lesser degree. While these certainly served as a great filter for who might stand for office, it appears that social mobility in Carthage was much more fluid than in many other places like Rome, which closely guarded the ranks of their aristocracy. As for how they were elected, we don't really know. Candidates might have been selected by existing members of the Senate, similar to how Roman senators were chosen by consuls or censors. Alternatively, there may have been an element of a democratic vote involving the popular assembly. Okay, so what did the Senate do? Well, principally they met to discuss affairs of state. Such meetings occurred regularly and would have been held in administrative hubs of the city, such as the buildings by the Great Marketplace or within the temple atop the Bursa Hill. Unfortunately, the exact protocols and procedures of these events are lost to time. But regardless of how things took place, we know that the Senate had broad authority over diplomatic, legislative, financial, and military matters. For example, during the Punic Wars, they would be the ones to receive Roman envoys, to declare war and peace, and to authorize the raising and deployment of military forces. The will of the Senate, however, was not the end-all, be-all on such matters. In many cases, proposals had to be submitted to the popular assembly for ratification, either because the matter lacked unanimous consent within the Senate, or simply due to the nature of the proposal in question. Let's now turn to this lower body for discussion. The popular assembly was the voice of the people, composed of the entire Carthaginian citizen body. Now, what exactly made someone a citizen is pretty obscure. Early on, it might have been pretty easy to trace one's ancestry to the initial founders of the city, but as the generations rolled by, this would have been a less and less practical measure. Likely, there would have been magistrates responsible for the census, who would have had some standards in place to update the citizen rolls, but again, we're unfortunately left in the dark on these matters. So what did the popular assembly do? Primarily, it elected magistrates and voted on policy decisions. These activities would have taken place in large, public areas where the assembly could reasonably fit, such as in the Great Market of Carthage. Just as with the Senate though, we don't really know about their protocols and procedures. However, one inscription researchers have found in a Libyan country town of this period records how an act was passed, quote, by the votes of all the gates. This would seem to indicate some sort of subgroup voting system based on one's regional or familial association, similar to that of the Roman tribal assembly. But again, we don't really have any direct evidence linking this specific practice to Carthage's popular assembly. Anyways, once these citizens were called up in the assembly, they would proceed to carry out their duties. In times of elections, they would have been able to choose from amongst the candidates running for high office, such as that of the Sophite and general. Other times they would have voted on Senate decisions. Here, Aristotle makes a point to state that the popular assembly did not merely sit and listen, but took part in free discussion of the matters at hand. Such participation allowed the people to exercise some degree of control over their government. Their ability to do so would wax and wane over the years, but appears to have gained greater prominence in the 3rd century BC as the people were forced to bear the brunt of the Punic Wars and clamored for greater influence. Now that we've covered the main trunk of the Carthaginian government, let's now talk about other major positions and bodies which made up its branches. One of the first positions I'd like to discuss is that of general. These were individuals appointed to lead the military in times of war. As a result, the availability and number of positions open at any given time would vary greatly. But once a position had to be filled, the candidate would be elected by the popular assembly. Their term of office had no limits, and generals would serve for the duration of a war or until recalled. So what did generals do? Well, as should be fairly obvious, they commanded armies or fleets. This would have involved supervising the raising of forces, conducting training, and leading their troops into battle. Generals could act independently or might work together in senior and junior capacities. One important point to mention is that the role of the Carthaginian general was purely military and separated from civil duties, which is to be heavily contrasted with the Roman system of warrior politicians. However, this distinction is not entirely black and white, since clearly it took political power to get elected general, and in theory, Carthaginian generals could simultaneously hold other offices, which might widen their total powers. The next series of government positions fall into a broad category of commissions. These were basically groups of magistrates who dealt with a variety of important public tasks. For instance, we have records mentioning a 5-man group for judging law cases, a 10-man group for overseeing sacred places, and a 30-man group for supervising taxes. These individuals appear to have been chosen by existing board members, going on to serve longer terms of office than most officials. But perhaps one of the most prestigious commissions was the Court of 104. This was a group of high judges appointed by merit who served for life. Their main duty appears to have been the oversight of military commanders, investigating generals or their officers, and punishing them for bad behavior. This might range from admonishing or fining commanders for their treatment of prisoners, to full-on crucifying generals for their defeats. While on the surface seemingly impartial, these trials must have been quite political, as generals were very often powerful figures with many important connections who wouldn't go down so easily without a fight. One must therefore imagine that such investigations often involved a lot of backdoor deal-making and the exchange of money and favors. Nonetheless, it was still an important institution that commanded much respect and served to keep the Punic military in line. Beyond this, we know very little. However, given the size and complexity of the Carthaginian civilization, there are surely many more bureaucratic positions lying beneath the shrouded surface of our historical record. After all, its institutions were highly praised by philosophers of the age. Isocrates, for instance, called it the best system of any state alongside Sparta, while Aristotle declared it to be a sound blend of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Indeed, from what little records we have of the Punic state, it appears to have been quite a stable government with few incidents of rising tyrants as can be seen in the Greek world, or uprising commoners as can be seen in the conflict of the orders in Rome. It is therefore fascinating to speculate what the ancient world might have looked like had the Punic model not been crushed under the boots of war. But alas, it seems we shall never know. Today, the religion of Carthage has long been forgotten. Yet in its time, this ancient belief system once permeated across much of the Mediterranean, with practitioners spread far and wide from the Near East to North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Spain, and beyond. However, precious little information has survived the destruction of Carthage, and what written records we have all come from non-Punic sources. This has unfortunately left us with a mysterious and heavily biased portrayal of this ancient pagan religion. Luckily, modern archaeology and research have done much to help us put together the pieces of this puzzle. Today, let us explore the fascinating reconstruction of the religion of Carthage. As with all things Carthaginian, we must first begin our discussion with the Phoenicians, from which they trace their origins. Theirs was an even older religion which had developed slowly in the milieu of the Bronze Age Levant, with influences from neighboring Mesopotamia and Egypt. Broadly speaking, it was a polytheistic religion with a wide pantheon of gods, which were associated with various natural phenomena or served as embodiments of certain traits. At their head was the supreme pair of El and Asherah. Beneath them were a host of other gods which might take a single form or be split into various manifestations. These gods were powerful entities, capable of intervention in human affairs with both favor and malice. Thus, followers adopted a broadly reciprocal religious practice, making prayers, offerings, and sacrifices to ensure they remained in the good graces of the gods. Often, this was done on the level of the city-state, with many rites being intermingled with the workings of public institutions. However, it would be impractical to please every conceivable deity. Communities therefore tended to focus their attention on a few chief figures or aspects of gods from the wider pantheon. In the Phoenician cities, these principal divinities were called Ba'alim, or lords of a city. The particular elevation of one deity over another would be a rather organic process, which changed over time based on the needs of a group. As an example, the chief Baal of Ugrit was Hadad, god of storm and rain. The Baal of Sidon was Eshmun, god of healing, and the Baal of Byblos was Baalat Gebal, goddess of fertility. But perhaps the most important for our story will be the religion of the city of Tyre and their chief Baal, Melkart. After all, it would be this leading Phoenician power which planted many colonies in the west and gave birth to Carthage, passing on many of its cultural traditions. There is much more to discuss when it comes to the religion of the Phoenicians and that of the Near East, but for the purposes of this episode, we will now turn our attention to its evolution in the West. As we have stated, the religion of Carthage was derived from the religion of the Phoenicians. Thus, the early colonists would have brought with them many of the gods and traditions of their ancestors. These beliefs were reinforced over the years by the close tie which was maintained between Carthage and its mother city. In fact, delegations were routinely sent back to Tyre to partake in religious ceremonies and make offerings to the gods. However, change was inevitable. The Punic pantheon saw internal transformation as various existing deities and their aspects rose or fell in popularity. For instance, one of the major trends was the elevation of the goddess Tanit over Melkart. The Punic pantheon also saw external transformation as a result of contact with the surrounding culture of the Libyans, Numidians, Greeks, Italians, Sardinians, and Iberians. New gods were adopted in their entirety, or might be equated and merged with existing ones. This process of syncretism worked both ways as various groups commingled over the centuries. For example, we see many new temples and cults springing up in areas of cross-pollination like Sicily, where the Punic god Melkart was hybridized with the Greek god Heracles. Thus, the Carthaginian religion would have ultimately evolved a character of its own, distinct from its Phoenician origins. Let's now take a look at its pantheon, its holy places, and its practices. We will begin with the pantheon of Carthage by discussing the major and minor gods. The first one to mention is the god Melkart. As we stated, he was the chief patron of Tyre, with some mythologies tying him to the founding of the city and the gifting of the first boat to its inhabitants. He was thus closely associated with the royal house of Tyre, as well as the important naval activities of trade, travel, and colonization. It's for this reason that he would eventually be conflated with Heracles, the great traveler and colonizer. In fact, the association was so strong that Herodotus claims that the temple of Heracles on Greek Thasos actually began as a temple of Melkart built by the Phoenicians. Another important god to mention will be Baal. While the name Baal most literally means god or lord and can be used as a general descriptor, it appears that the Phoenicians came to see Baal as a divine figure who was worshipped in aspects. Each of these represented a different facet of the god's personality, with power over things like agriculture or war. In Carthage, the most important aspect to be worshipped was Baal Hamon. Yet despite his massive popularity and position at the head of the pantheon, we don't actually know what he was the god of. Baal Hamon is often depicted as a bearded man with ram's horns, with the evidence suggesting he was likely tied to ideas of the sun, fire, rebirth, and fertility. But we really aren't sure. In this context, it's best to consider Baal Hamon as an all-purpose god whose chief role was to protect and watch over the city of Carthage and its inhabitants. Yet he did not do so alone. Baal Hamon was joined at the head of the pantheon by his consort Tanit, often referred to as the face of Baal. She seems to have also been viewed as a protector of the city of Carthage, with references to her as a fertility goddess, and even a goddess of war like Athena. In this capacity, she is commonly represented as a lion. Tanit may have first emerged as an aspect of the supreme goddess Astarte, but eventually developed her own following. She began appearing as an important deity in Carthage around the 5th century BC and quickly took a leading role, even eclipsing Baal Hamon at times. Indeed, though the pair often appear together, her name frequently comes first in inscriptions where they are both mentioned. Tanit's widespread popularity is also attested to by the sheer volume of her visual representations found across the Punic world, which show the goddess praying with her hands up under a crescent moon. Besides these 3 gods, there were dozens of others. However, information about them is fleeting. In these matters, it proves useful to see who they were paired with in the better understood Greek pantheon. For instance, Eshmun, who is often associated with Asclepius, appears to have been a god of healing, beauty, and love, while Resheph, who is associated with Apollo, appears to have been a god of fire, thunder, and plague. The roles of other gods are similarly vague, and we can only really tie them to simple ideas. Semes was a sun god, Hudis a god of the new moon, Kes a god of full moon, Kusor a god of intellect, and Hawat a god of the dead. Beyond this, we have references to yet more divinities, known to us only by names like Pumai, Sakun, and Arish. As we can see, the full pantheon of Carthage was quite extensive to the point that even people at the time must have struggled to remember them all. This is a notion that seems a bit odd to modern audiences who are used to living in a largely monotheistic world. We must, however, remember that back in the day, the polytheistic past was exploding with divinities, and people had an open mind about expanding their worldview. For example, the Carthaginians adopted Demeter and her daughter Kore from the Greeks while simultaneously adopting Isis from the Egyptians. As we stated before, other cultures also borrowed from the Carthaginians. In Sardinia, for instance, the locals adopted the minor god Cid as their patron deity, taking the place of Babi, a Nuragic god in the area. Now that we've covered the pantheon, let's turn to the way people interacted with their gods. The first question will be to ask, where were these gods? Well, according to most people from antiquity, they inhabited the world around us. But while one might happen to bump into one randomly, the most likely setting for an encounter was a sacred place in nature or near a temple. It appears that the Carthaginians recognized springs, rivers, and other waters as holy places. For instance, the general Hannibal swears on these in his oath with Philip V of Macedon. Temples and shrines were also important locations, which might be dedicated to a single god, several aspects of a god, or even multiple gods. These structures were the most direct manifestation of the Punic religion and were often closely tied to the state. As such, temples were frequently masterpieces of engineering and beauty. On Carthage's Bursa Hill, for instance, one would have found the spectacular temple of Eshmun, visible for all to see from miles around. Down the side of the hill, closer to the dockyard and the agora, lay the temple of Resheph, which was said to be covered in resplendent gold, with a massive statue of gilded bronze inside. Throughout the rest of the city and beyond were countless other magnificent facilities. While we have few records of them today, it is certain that given the wealth of Carthage, these would have been lavishly decorated in a manner similar to the Greeks. Okay, so we found the gods, or at least gotten within earshot of them. Now what? Well, now it's time to earn their favor. This could be done in a variety of ways, including prayer, offerings, and sacrifice. Prayers likely would have followed a similar format to the Hellenistic ones, whereby a person would recite an invocation, a claim, and a request. The invocation was a summons to the god or gods, listing them by their name and their attributes. The claim involved stating why the god should pay attention to you, and finally, the request listed what you hoped to receive from them. Offerings, meanwhile, were things given to the gods as tributes. These votives might include food, money, or other valuables. Small statues in particular seem to have been quite common as offerings, as archaeologists find them almost everywhere. Finally, sacrifice was the third and perhaps most important interaction with the gods. This involved the ritual killing of animals like rams, bulls, and lambs. Given the symbolic importance of fire and smoke in the Punic religion, these sacrifices would have been burnt alongside other special offerings like sacred plants. Many ancient sources also tell us that the practice of sacrifice even extended to humans, and in particular infants. These are said to have been ritualistically killed and burned in sacred areas called tophets, their ashes collected in urns and buried. Scholarly debate still surrounds this particular topic, and we'll be taking a look at this more in depth in another video. Simply put, we must take the propagandic account of non-pagan Carthaginians with a grain of salt. However, there does appear to be enough archaeological data to support this idea to some degree, and it is likely that child sacrifice was practiced at least as a measure of last resort when the city found itself in great peril. All of these activities we've mentioned would have been accompanied by a great deal of religious customs. Individuals may have been able to perform some of their own, but more often than not, priests would be involved to regulate and facilitate the process. According to our records, Carthage had a rather large bureaucracy of priests. At the very top would be the chief of priests, or Rab Kohanim. Beneath them were the head priests of the various temples, along with their acolytes. Serving Carthage's pantheon was highly prestigious, and thus priests and priestesses were most frequently from wealthy families. Curiously, they are supposed to have been completely clean-shaven from head to toe, though they are sometimes also depicted with normal body hair. Below them, we should imagine a huge staff of people ready to keep the sacred machine running. Attendants, clerks, sacred barbers, butchers, and more. Added to this support system were the Carthaginian associations, which were large social groups which participated in communal activities like feasting, public maintenance, and religious administration. This highly organized system would have been operational throughout the year, with many important festivals and rites to be performed to ensure the well-being of the state. As an indication of what was at play here, we can look at the annual celebration of Melkart in Tyre. This event, known as the Agersis, involved a highly choreographed ritual whereby each spring an effigy of the god was placed on a giant raft before being ritually burnt as it drifted out to sea, while hymns were sung by the assembled crowds. However, not everything operated on such a large scale. Private practice also occurred on the micro level as people sought out the help of the gods in their everyday lives. Some might have picked the most relevant god for their needs, while others made a habit of turning to one in particular. It is often thought that particular families, or at least the aristocracy, paid special reverence to their chosen patron god. Beyond this, we know very little about the beliefs of the Carthaginians. Some clues to their theology can be found by looking at burial sites, where tomb deposits point to the belief in an afterlife. However, what form it took and what criteria were required to get there are unknown. Unfortunately, this sort of mystery extends to much of the rest of the religion of ancient Carthage. Nonetheless, we hope that you've appreciated our attempt to bring to life its secrets. When we speak of great explorers, one imagines the likes of Columbus, Magellan, and da Gama, who traveled across the vast seas to discover exotic locations. However, the age of exploration in the 15th to 17th centuries was long predated by the often overlooked explorers of antiquity, who traveled vast distances beyond the edges of the known world. Among these, perhaps none were more prolific than the Carthaginians, who ventured out past the pond of the Mediterranean to explore what lay beyond in the Atlantic. Today, let us share in their discoveries. The past was a world filled with unknowns, not just for us learning about it today, but also for those experiencing it at the time. We must remember that for most of history, an individual's knowledge of the world was quite limited. Surely, they would have been familiar with their local community, and perhaps a few major nodes of civilization adjoining their own, but overall, their information bubble was small. Perhaps elders or traders spoke of what lay beyond, but one must imagine that these stories often blurred the lines of fact and fiction. Take for instance the famed tales of Herodotus, who claims to have traveled widely, conducting interviews and collecting reports for his book, The Histories. It is from him that we hear of giant ants the size of foxes in India, of hole-dwelling people who shrieked like bats in Libya, and of folk who neither ate living things nor had dreams in the Atlas Mountains. These sorts of distorted views of the world colored the perspective of our ancestors. Even the most well-informed knew precious little about the world at large. Now, I don't want to give you the false impression that people were entirely clueless of their surroundings. They weren't. Rather, my purpose with this preamble is to reset our modern frame of reference to the realities of just how pervasive the unknown was in the ancient world. Yet while the darkness might be frightening, it is also an invitation to those bearing torches. After all, a yearning to discover what lies beyond has long been a human trait. not just out of some vague romantic idea about the nature of humanity, but for the more practical realities that venturing into the unknown can yield great rewards. Things like new land, resources, and trade are the lifeblood of civilization, which can be unlocked by exploration to propel a people forward. This might be done on foot or on horseback, but by far the most common and efficient means of exploration was by water. This was especially true in the context of the ancient Mediterranean, which was essentially a giant pool around whose edges were gathered countless communities. Though these might lie months apart by land, they could lie just weeks apart by sea. Thus, the keys to the unknown were often unlocked by boats, or to be more precise, by galleys. These were long, narrow draft ships powered primarily by oar and backed up by sail. In the early days, it was the ancient Phoenicians of the Levant who pioneered the field through advanced construction methods and navigation. Their mastery of the waves allowed them to link the far-flung markets of the Mediterranean and grow rich from the profits. Over the centuries, Phoenicians would spread across the Mediterranean, founding a vast array of trading posts and colonies. Such was the extent of their reach that Herodotus even reports a rumor of them having rounded the entire continent of Africa on behalf of the Egyptians. Even today, there are theories that the Phoenicians made it all the way to the New World. While neither of these have real historical credence, it does speak to the prolific reputation of the ancient Phoenicians. It is from these first, great explorers that the Carthaginians would inherit their maritime skills. Let's now turn to discuss their activities. The Punic colony would have at first begun learning the ropes by conducting local affairs along the coast of Africa. However, within a few centuries, they had certainly risen to rival their eastern ancestors when it came to maritime exploits. When Phoenician power began to wane in the 7th century BC, it would be Carthage who carried on the torch of exploration, leading it boldly into parts unknown. This was achieved by forging a vast maritime empire capable of not only maintaining the old network of trade routes, but also expanding its tendrils into the far corners of the known world. Now, gold, silver, copper, lead, tin, salt, grain, hides, wine, oil, textiles, jewelry, ivory, and many more goods bustled across the sea lanes at an ever-increasing pace. This Carthaginian trade network was built and maintained by the deployment of seaborne fleets composed of merchant, military, and expeditionary vessels. Merchant fleets, for instance, served as the workhorses for the mass transportation of goods. Military fleets, meanwhile, offered protection against raiders and rivals. And lastly, expeditionary fleets set up new trade posts and colonies which ultimately constituted the backbone of the Carthaginian Sea Empire. It is this group which we shall focus on. So what would one of these expeditionary fleets look like? Well, they would have been composed of wooden galley ships powered by oars and sails. There were a variety of different types in common usage at the time, including the popular pentaconter and later the bireme and trireme models. Small fleets might consist of just a handful of ships with 100 or so men in total. Over time as Carthage grew, however, it would send out larger and larger expeditions, which are reported to have fielded dozens of ships with tens of thousands of men aboard. Doing so was no easy task, as building, outfitting, staffing, and supplying such expeditions could be incredibly expensive. For reference, in classical Athens, a warship cost around 57 pounds of silver just to maintain each month. Thus, these larger expeditionary fleets would have required the backing of wealthy private investors or politicians who could leverage the government's treasury. In return, these sponsors not only expected substantial financial returns, but also the prestige associated with launching such an expedition. For example, we have records of expeditionary treasures lining the temples of Carthage alongside inscriptions recounting the related adventures for all in the city to see. But how would the actual exploration process unfold? Well, as we stated, ships would leave their harbors and venture forth either under oar or sail power. We are told that on a good day, a captain could expect to travel somewhere around 100 kilometers. In theory, a ship could therefore cross the 1,600 kilometer wide Mediterranean in about 2 to 3 weeks. However, things weren't so simple. Ships had to make frequent stops to rest and resupply due to the limited space aboard. Galleys thus frequently pulled into port or onto a beach for the night to allow the crew to camp, gather supplies, cook, and sleep. One must imagine the great contrast between how this daily activity took place while in familiar, friendly territory, as opposed to unknown and potentially hostile lands. Another reason to hug the coast was to avoid the dangers of open waters. Rough seas and storms could easily sink a ship by either flooding or outright breaking it into pieces. Yet shallow waters too had their own risks. Hidden sandbars or rocks could just as easily wreck a ship, but at least in these cases, the crew had a better chance of survival. Fleets traveling at sea, therefore, had to be extremely careful with their movements. But how did captains navigate in an age before detailed sea charts, radar, and GPS? Well, generally, ancient captains used landmarks by day or the stars and moon by night to judge their position. They would also keep notes on their daily bearing and distance traveled so as to estimate how far along they were in their journey. For reference, captains could refer to existing logs and rudimentary charts which had been produced by others who had come before them. Well-traveled routes would have plenty of readily available information, while the opposite was true for areas off the beaten path. In some cases, a captain might have to rely on the notes of a single navigator, perhaps translated several times and dating back decades or even centuries. Other times, they had nothing to go on. In these situations, the fleet would have to advance with utmost caution. Carthaginian captains used sounding weights to measure water depth and might even dredge up material from the seabed for analysis. Keeping careful notes would be critical for finding one's way back home and would be an incredibly valuable product of the expeditionary journey. A captain's notes included a wealth of information including sailing itineraries, lists of ports, warnings about dangerous regions, and all kinds of geographical and ethnological descriptions of what was encountered. Such a set of notes, known in Greek as a periplos, therefore functioned as the closest thing to an atlas in the ancient world. They would be distributed and translated widely across the Mediterranean, with copies being passed on for generations. But perhaps the most famous peripli of the ancient world were produced by Carthage's greatest explorers, Hanno and Himilco the Navigators. Let us now relive their journeys. Both explorers lived in the 6th century BC and appear to have been contemporaries. Almost certainly they were rich aristocrats who may have been able to partially or even fully fund the expeditions themselves. Together, they would strike out to explore the lands beyond the Mediterranean by traveling out into the Atlantic Ocean. Sailing past the Pillars of Hercules, the two explorers would then veer in opposite directions. Himilco's journey would take him north. Unfortunately, the full account of his adventures have been lost, and we are left with just quotes and references from later authors. As a result, we know very little about Himilco himself or the composition of his fleet. However, it does appear that their primary goal was to find the mysterious Cassiterides, the Tin Islands. Tin was an incredibly valuable resource in antiquity which could be combined with copper to produce bronze. It might also be mixed with lead to create low melting point alloys, which could be used to join all kinds of other materials in the production of crafts such as jewelry, pottery, and tools. Tin was also quite rare, making it a highly prized trading commodity. Himilco appears to have sought the primary source of tin by retracing its distribution route. Surely, his profit margin would be substantially higher if he could buy tin for cheap from the original supplier rather than the 100th middleman down the line. And so he traveled west from the main Punic territories to Iberia, which was a major hub along the tin trade route. Here, he encountered the Tartessian tribes who were highly active in the market. Some tin was indeed produced in the area, but most of it was imported from their own trade routes running up north. Himilco thus spent weeks following these and other routes up along the shores of Western Europe. Along the way, he would have stopped to resupply, trade, and gather information. The further he went, the more strange things became for this North African explorer. Apparently, his account described dense seaweed which slowed the fleet to a crawl, doldrums that forced the men to row their way out of them, thick fog that made it impossible to navigate accurately, and vicious sea monsters that accosted them. This journey into the lands of myth must have been quite harrowing, and we are told that it lasted a whopping 4 months to complete. It is hard to tell from our sparse records just how far they went, but some historians have estimated that they may have made it so far as the tip of Brittany in France or Cornwall in England. Upon its return, however, Himilco would have been able to tell an incredible story of his daring adventures and of course cash in on its immense profits. Such was the lasting impact of his incredible periplus that it would still be written about 800 years later. However, the exact details of his route appear to have been a closely guarded secret among the Carthaginians, who did not wish for others to be able to find the fabled land of tin. The other famous Carthaginian adventurer of this period was Himilco's contemporary, Hanno. Luckily, an abridged Greek translation of his account has actually survived from antiquity, and we are thus in a better position to describe his expedition. This one is reported to have begun with a huge flotilla of 60 pentaconters carrying 30,000 people. It was stuffed to the brim with all kinds of supplies and many passengers, including not only the crew, but also a huge complement of colonists. I will actually quote our records directly so you get a first-person view of the expedition. After passing through the Pillars of Hercules, we went on and sailed for 2 days' journey beyond, where we founded the first city, which we called Thymiaterium. It lay in the midst of a great plain. Sailing thence towards the west, we came to Salois, a promontory of Libya, bristling with trees. Having set up an altar here to Neptune, we proceeded again, going toward the east for half the day, until we reached a marsh lying no great way from the sea, thickly grown with tall reeds. Here also were elephants and other wild beasts feeding in great numbers. Going beyond the marshes a day's journey, we settled cities by the sea, which we called Caracas Marus, Gida, Acra, Melita, and Arambis. Sailing thence, we came to the Lixus, a great river flowing from Libya. By it, a wandering people, the Lixitas, were pasturing their flocks, with whom we remained some time, becoming friends. Above these folk lived unfriendly Ethiopians dwelling in a land full of wild beasts and shut off by great mountains, from which they say the Lixus flows, and on the mountains live men of various shapes, cave dwellers, who, so the Lixitas say, are fleeter on foot than horses. Taking interpreters from them, we sailed 12 days toward the south along a desert, turning thence towards the east 1 day's sail. There, within the recess of a bay, we found a small island having a circuit of 15 stadia, which we settled, and called it Cerne. From our journey, we judge it to be situated opposite Carthage, for the journey from Carthage to the Pillars and thence to Cerne was the same. Thence, sailing by a great river whose name was Crates, we came to a lake, which had 3 islands, larger than Cerne. Running a day's sail beyond these, we came to the end of the lake, above which rose great mountains, peopled by savage men wearing skins of wild beasts, who threw stones at us and prevented us from landing our ships. Sailing thence, we came to another river, very great and broad, which was full of crocodiles and hippopotami, and then we turned about and went back to Cerne. Thence we sailed toward the south 12 days, following the shore, which was peopled by Ethiopians who fled from us and would not wait. And their speech, the Lixitas translators who were with us could not understand. But on the last day, we came to great wooded mountains. The wood of the trees was fragrant and of various kinds. Sailing around these mountains for 2 days, we came to an immense opening of the sea, from either side of which there was level ground inland, from which at night we saw fire leaping up on every side at intervals, now greater, now less. Having taken in water there, we sailed along the shore for 5 days until we came to a great bay, which our interpreters said was the Horn of the West. In it there was a large island, and within the island a lake of the sea, in which there was another island. Landing there during the day, we saw nothing but forests, but by night many burning fires, and we heard the sound of pipes and cymbals, and the noise of drums and a great uproar. Then fear possessed us, and the soothsayers commanded us to leave the island. And then, quickly sailing forth, we passed a burning country full of fragrance, from which great torrents of fire flowed down to the sea, but the land could not be come at for the heat. And we sailed along with all speed, being stricken by fear. After a journey of 4 days, we saw the land at night covered with flames. And in the midst there was one lofty fire, greater than the rest, which seemed to touch the stars. By day, this was seen to be a very high mountain, called the Chariot of the Gods. Thence, sailing along by the fiery torrents for 3 days, we came to a bay, called the Horn of the South. In the recess of this bay there was an island, like the former one, having a lake, in which there was another island, full of savage men. There were women too, in even greater numbers. They had hairy bodies, and the interpreters called them the Gorilli. When we pursued them, we were unable to take any of the men, for they all escaped by climbing the steep places and defending themselves with stones. But we took 3 of the women, who bit and scratched their leaders and would not follow us. So we killed them and flayed them, and brought their skins to Carthage, for we did not voyage further, provisions failing us. Thus ends the tale. It's an incredible account to just read about, and one's imagination runs wild at just thinking what it would have been like to experience in person. Many academics have tried to match Hanno's description to physical locations, and thus create a map of his expedition. As one might imagine, this is quite a tricky task, and there are a wide variety of hypothesized routes. One of these proposes that the fleet made it all the way to Cameroon, near the equator. If true, this would have meant a round-trip journey of some 16,000 kilometers, or 40% of the Earth's circumference. The sheer scope of these expeditions is mind-blowing to me, and speaks to the incredible feats of the Carthaginian civilization that all too often go overlooked. Ancient Carthage is a fascinating, yet deeply mysterious subject. Vanishingly little information about the civilization survived its fall, and we are left with just a handful of outside sources to illuminate the past. Our most detailed accounts are therefore precious, but biased, in their primary focus on the topics of trade, politics, and warfare. It's no surprise then that we get rather simplistic descriptions about the Carthaginians as people. They were imperialistic, scheming, religiously devout, and rich beyond measure. However, by digging through the literature and analyzing other sources, we can attempt to bring light to the darkness. In this video in particular, it will be our goal to reconstruct what it would have been like to grow up Carthaginian. Before we descend to the ground level, I wanted to give you a bird's eye view of the social landscape of Carthage. The city had its origins as a Phoenician colony built around the 800s BC upon the strategic crossroads of several Mediterranean trade routes. In these early days, its population was made up mostly of emigrants from Tyre, whose numbers could be counted in the low thousands. Over the centuries, though, it would slowly evolve into something more. Carthage's rise to power began by first dominating its native and colonial neighbors, before expanding into the wider Mediterranean through a mixture of economic pressure and military force. Soon, it would come to lead virtually all the Phoenician colonies in the west, along with many other communities in Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearics, and Iberia. By the time of the First Punic War in the 3rd century BC, it directly or indirectly controlled vast swaths of the Mediterranean with trade networks that extended far beyond this inner sea. Ruling over the Punic Empire would be a pair of annually elected chief magistrates called Sophites, a senate, a popular assembly, numerous commissions, and all manner of other bureaucratic positions. The general populace, meanwhile, was a stratification of nobles, landed elites, wealthy merchants, military officers, working-class commoners, immigrants, freemen, slaves, and more. At its peak, the population likely numbered in the hundreds of thousands and was quite a diverse reflection of the cosmopolitan nature of the empire. We know, for instance, that Libyan and Greek influence became quite prominent in the city, while yet more exotic ethnicities were seeded by the practice of employing foreign auxiliaries and mercenaries. Unlike some of its more insular contemporaries, Carthage was fairly welcoming when it came to admitting at least some of these outside groups into its full or partial citizen ranks, provided they were of sufficient wealth and merit. However, it appears that the upper echelons of society were largely dominated by those with a long lineage of Punic ancestry. Beyond this, we have little understanding of how the rest of society was organized. There are, however, clues. For instance, we hear of how powerful aristocratic families like the Magonids or Barkids dominated politics for generations. This indicates some system of factions with underlying structures of socio-political support. But whether this came in the form of some tribal or patronage system as in Rome, we don't know. Another clue comes from Aristotle, who suggests that the Carthaginians belonged to associations, which shared communal meals similar to those in Sparta, but again, its specifics are unclear. Other clues have led some to postulate that society could have been organized around religious cults, professional guilds, and neighborhood districts. It's very hard to tell for sure, but it honestly seems quite plausible that all were present to some degree in such a large and diverse city as Carthage. As for the foundation level of society, the family, we again know very little. Your average Carthaginian family likely had 2 parents, several children, and a couple members of the extended family hanging around. Each family unit would naturally reside in a dwelling, the shape and size of which would be a reflection of their socioeconomic status. Most Carthaginians would have lived in a simple, flat-roof structure with a few small rooms and a built-in cistern. Others might live in cramped apartment complexes or in lines of street-facing dwellings that doubled as shops. The more well-off might have more expansive properties with numerous floors and courtyards. The most elite had small palaces and estates with additional properties beyond the walls of the city. Now with all of that out of the way, let's finally see what it would be like to grow up Carthaginian. By luck of the draw, a child would be born into one of the families we previously mentioned. There were no hospitals, and as was common across the Mediterranean, children were delivered in the home. For those who could afford it, this often took place in a specially prepared room with the assistance of a midwife or doctor. But no matter one's social rank, it is sure that all families would have prepared one way or another by seeking the help of the gods. Childbirth, after all, was quite dangerous for both mother and child, with mortality rates of babies being around 40%. In Carthage, parents would have used prayers, offerings, amulets, and all kinds of other measures to ensure that the likes of Eshmun, god of healing, and Tanit, goddess of fertility, would protect them. Babies which survived this first trial would likely have been celebrated with gift and name-giving ceremonies, as is common across most societies. From our records, it seems that the Carthaginians used single names, to which might be added patronymic and location identifiers in a manner similar to the Greeks. For instance, whereas the famous Athenian orator would be called Demosthenes, son of Demosthenes of Paeania, his Carthaginian counterpart might be called Saphot, son of Yatunbal of Hippocra. As for the names themselves, we have records of at least 500 different examples for men and women. Interestingly enough, it turns out that most of these had their roots in the name of some deity. For example, Hamilcar means servant of Melkart, Abstart means servant of Astarte, Hannibal means Baal, be gracious to me, Zakarbal means Baal, remember me, Himilco means Melkart is my brother. I could go on, but you get the point. The Carthaginians were a religious lot. In theory, there were countless ways in which one could follow this practice and get a fairly unique name. However, it seems that a few names in particular were quite popular, and the elite tended to pick from a small pool of titles. It's for this reason we confusingly hear of so many Hannos, Hamilcars, and Hasdrubals in their histories. Assuming a named child remained in good health, it would be raised within the family unit. He or she would primarily learn from their mother, who would spend most of her time raising children. If the mother was lucky, she might have relatives or other children who could aid in the process. If the family was wealthy, the child might also be taught basic lessons from slaves, servants, or nurses. Much would be absorbed through passive observation as the baby slowly began to speak the first words of their parents' tongue and the prevailing Punic language of Carthage. Within just a few years, the child would be expected to begin contributing around the home. One of their most fundamental duties would be to assist in the religious rituals that helped keep families safe from misfortunes caused by evil spirits and demons. Written and archaeological evidence suggests that in Phoenician culture, it was women who led most of these daily activities and passed them on to future generations. This involved making offerings, reciting prayers, and preparing special remedies to promote good health. In addition, young children would also help perform various chores. They prepared food, fetched water, washed clothes, swept rooms, and assisted in whatever ways were demanded of them. Soon, these tasks would become more specialized. Boys, for instance, began to take up the trades of their fathers, or might be sent to learn from a skilled family member or friend. Growing up in a bustling port city ensured that many learned to produce goods that could be sold or traded at the market, and often made trips to the shore to catch fish, which could feed their family. It would be up to the father when they were deemed old enough to begin taking on more hazardous tasks. This might include metalworking in the workshops along the Byrsa Hill, tending to the fields and orchards which surrounded the city, rigging their first sail on a boat in the merchant harbor, or joining the ranks of the army and navy. Girls might also have taken on some of these tasks. However, for the most part they followed after their mothers by taking on the important duties of the domestic sphere. They cooked, cleaned, made textiles, performed religious duties, and may have acquired special skills like playing an instrument to provide entertainment and attract future husbands. Depending on a family's social status, more formal education may have been provided. Communal schooling is likely to have been present, and the elite in particular could be expected to have tutors lined up for their children. Sons of merchants, for instance, might start to learn principles of navigation, arithmetic, and trade, while also picking up a few extra languages to assist in their future endeavors. Sons of prominent nobles might also learn to be an officer in the army or navy. Elite daughters, meanwhile, may have been taught the art of aristocratic culture to gain influence for the family and exert their soft power across the community, or may have been prepared for a life of duty serving in one of the city's many prestigious cults. Along the way, both boys and girls celebrated a variety of coming-of-age milestones. Unfortunately, we have no evidence with which to provide any specifics. Given the devout nature of the Carthaginians, though, it is likely that many of these involved some religious rites. Birthdays were surely important, and one's transition from adolescence to adulthood would have been a major celebration. As was common across the Mediterranean, this usually occurred sooner for girls, who in their teens would begin to prepare for marriage. The men that they married were usually much older, and the marriages were frequently arranged. Though in Carthage proper it seems monogamy was the standard, some of its neighboring cultures practiced polygamy. Thus, there were probably some men living in Carthage who had multiple wives. But even if nominally monogamous, adultery was rampant in the ancient world, and it was frequent for a husband to have concubines or paramours. Once married, couples would soon begin to have their own children, and the process we described would be repeated. But rather than end the video there, I wanted to share the hypothetical stories of two made-up Carthaginians, Zacherbal and Mago, who will help us bring this entire story to life. In 328 BC, Zacherbal is born in the city of Carthage, the fifth child of his mother. He has a sister and a brother, and would have had 2 more siblings had they not died in infancy. Like many Carthaginians, he is given a religious name, meaning something like Baal remember me. Though his father is Punic, his mother is Sicilian Greek. Unlike in Rome and Greece, marriages with foreigners were common amongst the Carthaginians, and despite his mother, Zacherbal is allowed full Carthaginian citizenship. As traders and merchants, Zacherbal's family are wealthy enough to be able to afford a nurse and several slaves. Through his mother, Zacherbal first learns Punic and soon takes up Greek, in part from his mother and in part through the slaves of his household, a few of whom are Greek themselves. Over time, he learns to read and write in the most basic fashion, to better assist his father at work. Perhaps most importantly though, his mother and father teach him to honor the gods, bring offerings, and conduct himself properly at sacrifices and religious feasts. Similar to the Romans, Zacherbal's diet consists of a lot of grain, fish, wine, and olive oil. He particularly enjoys garum, a sauce made by fermenting small fish with herbs and salt. Zacherbal's friends include people of many ethnicities, including Libyans, Greeks, and Carthaginians, all living in the city. He frequently plays with a young slave that his parents bought, and makes friends with a soldier's son whose father is Italian and mother African. Zacherbal has a bunch of toys, including some wooden carved soldiers, a wheeled horse figurine, and a set of knuckle bones. But perhaps his favorite toy is a wooden boat carved by an ancestor who had accompanied Hanno the Navigator on his legendary journey beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Zacherbal clings fondly to these stories and often begs his grandfather to take him back to the temple where he can observe the treasures and scriptures of these spectacular adventures. On long summer days, he stares out at the ships leaving harbor, wishing one day that he too will go on his own adventures. Luckily at age 12, Zacherbal's father takes him on his first overseas trading voyage to Neapolis in Italy. Zacherbal has been helping his father conduct business for years, but up until this point has never been taken on a dangerous sea journey. He is nervous, but excited. Before they leave, they conduct proper sacrifices, and Zacherbal is taught some of the rites associated with honoring the gods before a naval voyage. When they reach their destination of Neapolis, they stay in the Punic quarter of the city, where they share a meal with another group of traders from the Carthaginian city of Utica. He overhears many fascinating stories and begins to daydream once again. However, he snaps back to attention when the tone in the room has shifted. His father is now talking about the possibility of war coming to Sicily. Zacherbal tries to speak up and ask questions, but is given a swat on the hand to silence him. They speak of this no further. In the morning, Zacherbal helps his father and shipmates unload their goods for sale in the market. They carry many items, including ivory and fish, but also trinkets and jewelry. The amount of money exchanged is staggering to Zacherbal, but the next day, his father exchanges most of their profits in the marketplace again for shipments of Greek pottery and wine. Zacherbal is confused, but his father intends to teach him that these will fetch a much better price in Carthage. With that, they board their ship and return back home. 5 years later, war breaks out in Sicily between Carthage and the Syracusan tyrant Agathocles. Zacherbal hears that name spat in the streets, but for the most part, life continues as usual in the city. Every once in a while, Zacherbal notices soldiers and mercenaries stopping in the city. They tell so many stories that a part of him wishes to drop everything and join them on their adventures. When his father catches wind of these fantasies, they are laughed off. However, in 310 BC, when Zacherbal is 18, things change drastically. Zacherbal hears that Agathocles of Syracuse has actually landed with an army in Africa. Panic washes over the city. A few riots and protests break out, and the city decides to draft the Carthaginian citizenry into the army for the first time in hundreds of years. Zacherbal is one of those drafted. He is terrified, but hides it well. Perhaps this will finally be the great adventure he has long been waiting for. Yet those hopes are quickly crushed. Zacherbal witnesses the destruction and horror of warfare firsthand, as his unit fights for 3 long years against not just Greeks, but the Numidians who have joined them. In the faces of these enemies he is forced to slay, he sees only his childhood friends. By the time the war ends in 307 BC, Zacherbal is a changed man. He returns to the embrace of his parents, but feels numb. Only the sight of his small boat rekindles some of the youthful hope he once had before the war. Let's now turn to Mago. Our second Carthaginian is a stark contrast to Zacherbal and serves to remind us of the hundreds of thousands of Carthaginians who were not wealthy or upper class. In 348 BC, a Sicilian mother gives birth to a healthy boy named Polemarchus. His father is wealthy and upper class, and it seems to all that Polemarchus has a bountiful life ahead of him. But war makes fools of us all. In 343 BC, renewed war in Sicily sees his family members killed or enslaved by Carthaginians. Polemarchus himself is collapsed in shackles and shipped back to Carthage, where he is bought by a wealthy Carthaginian man who erases his history and gives him the Punic name Mago. He is valued not for his humanity, but because he speaks Greek. As a still impressionable child, Mago picks up Punic over time and refines his language skills through interactions with his enslavers. As a young boy, Mago lacks many of the amenities that Zacherbal had as a child. He has 1 or 2 toys, and his favorite food matters little, as he does not pick what he eats. Though Mago makes friends with a couple of other children living in the city, he is allowed little time to play with anyone outside of the family. Nevertheless, Mago finds that he is treated well by the Carthaginians, and if he were in Rome, his treatment might have been much harsher, and he is grateful for this. He even hears that Carthaginian slaves might eventually attain their freedom and work their way into partial or full citizenship. But for now, Mago is still a slave and is subject to occasional beatings as a child and the complete erasure of his character and freedom. Over time, Mago loses track of how old he is. He barely remembers his own parents, and when people ask where he is from, he can only say Sicily. His own name he holds onto, but no one has used it for years. He receives no formal education, but instead learns his master's business as he serves him from a young age. Nevertheless, Mago becomes skilled in his forced occupation. As a teenager, he begins to make deals in his master's name, and he is rewarded in small amounts for his efforts. It takes Mago several years, but finally, he saves enough money to start his own small business. Mago judges that he is probably about 22 by this point, but he's not exactly sure. With permission from his Carthaginian master, Mago begins selling goods of his own, turning quite the profit in the process and paying a portion to his owner. Eventually, Mago saves up enough money to purchase his own freedom for a large sum of money. Mago's owner agrees to grant him his freedom, but there is a mutual understanding that Mago will still remain tied to his enslaver's family. And, even if he wanted to leave, Mago knows nothing but trading by this point. His childhood and early years where he might have gone down a different path were robbed from him. Besides, Mago liquidated most of his savings to buy his freedom and is now back to square one. Thus, a newly freed Mago returns to work for his master, with little difference from before. Mago believes that he is nearing his 40s by now, and considers himself lucky that he was freed at such a young age. Hopefully, he can find a wife and have children whose futures will be brighter.
A quick reminder again that if you're a heavy user of YouTube like myself and you want to enjoy ad-free, in the background and offline streaming of content, consider YouTube Premium, and if you use the link in the description below, we'll get a part of the commission from your sign-up. So check it out, enjoy, and I'll see you.
I have to say, these episodes on Carthage and daily life in the past are some of my favorite topics in the world to cover. They are great reminders of the very real, lived experience of our history that so often gets overlooked by traditional education and even our own ancient sources who care little for the lives of your average everyday commoner. Let me know what other topics you would like to see covered next. A huge thanks to the patrons for funding the channel, and to the researchers, writers, and artists who made this episode possible. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other episodes on Carthage. See you in the next one.